Hi, Maria.
Hi, Steve. Hi.
Hello. Here, hold on. Let me just change my view here. That video. Oh my goodness.
And you know how I found it? I was looking for our video
Ah,
so that I could share our video. And I was just like, Astra Taylor about Unschooled. Like, what is this?
are you familiar with her and her work?
No.
No,
This is the
I'm not
first time I've
either.
heard of her, but now her documentaries look super interesting.
They do. Yeah, I'm gonna check her out. Part of me wants to share it with Soraya, my sister, because she's a documentary filmmaker and she's right now interested in, where education is at in our country. So
Oh, that would be a great one. She does such an incredible job with history.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hey.
Ooh, you look so gorgeous on that light, Lisa. You just like spotlight. Oh, you're muted, honey. We can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm like on fire watching this video. It is so, I'm only halfway through and I'm like, I'm gonna watch it for one more minute. It's almost time. It's almost time. I'm just like, wow.
I know. It
What
was
a
so good. I want to like catalog all the references she shared too.
Well, you know, one the thing that's so, I don't know, funny, I don't know what you want to call it, but it's like we all, the three of us, we know this. We talk about this, you know what I mean? But like, because she's lived through it and is saying all of it, it just, oh, it feels so good. I'm so like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to watch it again. And then I want to watch it with my kids because,
Yes.
you know, oh wow, what a resource. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'm so thankful that it landed on my lap. And yeah, it was automatic, just like what we needed to hear, the three of us, based on our last conversation.
Mhm.
Oh my goodness, so much. It was,
And
I
I'm
wanted to share,
surprised. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I wanted to share with you guys how my children responded. Acacia was like, not even halfway through, was just like, do I need to sit here? So I was like, yeah, I mean, I really was more interested in like the older kids because they're more in that transition to thinking about adulthood in a new way. And it was interesting. We didn't watch the whole thing. I think it was very heady for them, and it was less engaging to their age. Because it was constructed more as an essay, and I understood that. But what was interesting to hear is just how it wasn't like a shocker for them. Like everything to them was just like, yeah, this is what it's like. Like this is what our lives look like. There was not necessarily anything new. And so when we started kind of getting into a conversation of, well, what does this mean in terms of your relationship to society, to school culture, and especially for Calvas, he's wanting to engage in that direction. It's just this fascinating understanding that both of them are engaging with their learning in such a different way. And for Saba in particular, just feels so grounded in her ability to learn anything. And so to watch Astra Taylor be a documentarian, you know, without ever going to film school and do all the things that she does, a philosopher without ever, you know, having a master's in philosophy, like being able to achieve all these things for Saba, which is like, of course, like this is all I've been doing. And I think that it was a great translation for her to see someone who just took that all the way into adulthood, even though, because Astra, I don't know if you got to this place, she talks about the societal pressure that she felt at some point in her life to need to go in the direction of school. And did it, right? Like followed that. But I have seen Seba also feel that, like also go through that process of like, okay, this has been great, but in the whole picture of society, there's this other thing. And this is the only way to get to X. But then here's Astra saying, I thought that was the only way to get to X. And then I realized that I really didn't want to spend my time doing that. And I'd rather spend my time learning things. And this is the conclusion that Seba, without watching that part of Astra saying that, she came to that same conclusion for herself.
That's
It's
awesome.
It's so
Because there's so much truth in it that, you know, of course it's gonna resonate.
I had this sort of epiphany today. This morning I went and I photographed an organic mushroom farm in Jersey City. It's just I went and did photos for their website, and you know, I came away from it and I was just like so thankful. And I was thinking about how I really love meeting people like through my photo work, right? Which again, like is unschooled. I've never taken a photography class. Like it's just something I've been wanting to do, but through it, I've had the real like blessing of meeting a lot of people who are switching careers or taking like a passion and trying to make it into something that will be lucrative for them in order to leave a job that no longer, you know, they've come to realize that they don't love. But I was just like, I loved meeting the guys running this farm so much. You could feel their passion. They were so into it and they were so excited about everything they were doing. And I just was thinking like, part of what I love about being a photographer is meeting these people who are so into the thing they're doing. And I love, it doesn't matter what they're doing. It's more like the passion about it. And I was just like, oh my gosh, these are all like unschooling moments, because all of these people are like, you know, I used to work in finance and then I took a mushroom class and I realized you know, and it's just like, there's so much, and it's like, I love working with them and they love talking to me and they love talking to each other. And it's this whole energy. And I don't know, I just was reflecting on how it's not often that you like talk to an adult and they talk about their job or even about like anything that they're doing, where they have this just like, you know, joie de vivre, where they're just like, oh my gosh, I'm exploring, I'm creating, like, and I don't know, it just was just such a cool, I just was like, oh, I love what I'm doing. I love it, I love it, I love it. And I love that I'm meeting other people who love what they're doing. And in a weird way, it's like, you know, as an adult, it's hard to translate it because, like, you know, I went to school, I have a college degree, like, you know, I still am like, it's hard to apply the unschooling way to myself, even though I am doing it, you know, but it's why it's still kind of shocking or like invigorating or electrifying to listen to Astra speak, because she grew up without school, and like hearing her still sort of get caught in the loops of like what is supposed to be and like what is the prescribed path, and like you're only legitimate if you go through those steps, and then being able to wheel it back. And I feel like, right, even from our conversation last week, like I have been doing a lot of researching about tutoring for my kids, and I'm like, how do I get back in this loop, you know, not because like partially from their interest, but also partially because I'm like, you know, it's about time. And I'm like, why am I getting stuck in this loop again, where they're just so happily exploring what they want to explore. But I think in a way, right, there is this like feeling of like falling back on a known path that still feels kind of comfortable, even though, you know, I can see all the benefits and I can see how comfortable they are teaching themselves whatever they want. Like, I think again, in the end, it's still my discomfort am I capable of teaching myself everything I want? And am I capable of getting where I want to go without credentials? You know, and it's so much to pick apart and undo. And yeah, anyway, thank you for sharing that video. I can't wait to watch the rest of it. I'm like, so excited.
That's so exciting about, I loved how you shared that, and that feeling of kinship and aliveness of humans, of witnessing humans being alive and connected to what excites them and contributing something to the world that is intrinsically like theirs and unique. And just the feeling of getting into conversations with people who aren't just like bored out of their minds and depressed about what they're doing. Yeah, there was so much in that. I took some notes that popped out, and there was so much more I didn't take notes about, but like that, do we trust people's capacity to be curious? You know, and then, you know, of course, I also go down that rabbit hole of, well, but what, you know, yeah, what are the kids interested in? And are they just getting like the media, right? They get a lot of information, and like you call it, the YouTube university, but there's also something that she didn't have growing up, which is things like TikTok that just scrolls information. But as I say that, you know, and my hesitation and fear and like, well, are there in my judgment? But then sometimes they'll share something, you know, in this moment, I'm remembering that sometimes they'll share things with me that they learned on that. And of course, I'll say, well, you need to verify the information and everything. But sometimes it's just like really interesting facts and information that gets them curious about something or excited even. So I'm just thinking out loud, like working through that piece of that loop you were talking about, going into, you know, tutor, like how we talk about strewing information, but how am I doing that? Am I able to, do I back off to, it's this constant, it's a constant activity being an unschooling parent, right? You're like constantly questioning and being aware. And I guess all parents, right, go through the questioning, am I doing this right? But for me personally, I sometimes agonize over how much are they learning? How much do I need to get them to learn in a certain container that is standard? Yeah. So but I love that she addressed that. And then, well, I want to share that video on our feed, and we should share it on the recording of this if we share this too, just so that everybody can watch it. And I'm so surprised that it was 12 years ago. Like when I was watching it, I thought this was now until you said.
She is 2 years old. I mean, it's just, it also gave me, when I found out her age and just like her whole trajectory, I was just in awe of all the parents then that were part of that historical wave that she's talking about, right? And it made me appreciate my mother even more. You know, like my mother was coming, she was a little bit earlier than that wave of the 60s, because she was already sort of ahead of the curve in terms of like really feeling critical about where the United States was in the 1950s, right? 40s and 50s. And so by the time it was the 70s and I was born, she had had a full arc of experience about what it means when you say there's a different way. there's a different way of being on earth. And then, you know, her trajectory to Chiapas, you know, her trajectory to marrying into an indigenous community, right? And having mixed indigenous children. That was it. So I'm the last child. So by that trajectory, like she comes to see there's different ways of being on earth, and there's different ways of learning, and there's innate ways of capacity within human beings. And so I just wanted to honor her so much in that moment as I'm watching this video, right? Like just to say, okay, I can actually get strength from her courage to have really followed that opening to something different, you know, to really believe in it, to really listening. I think we talked a little bit about this last time, to really listening to that intuitive knowledge when something doesn't feel quite right. When something is not feeling quite right in this life that we get, it's a signal, right? Like there is something else. And going back to Astra, but also to just so many thinkers, and I know that we've talked about this in the unschooling, in our unschooling conversations and with other unschoolers. If we don't come at that with curiosity, right? If we don't engage with that moment of like, there's gotta be something different. One, if we don't listen, well, we'll be stuck in the same place. But when we listen, if we don't bring up curiosity to that, like, there's gotta be something different. And then bring that curiosity, just say, take a deep breath and pause and just wonder, what would that different thing look like? What could that different way of being be? Yeah, so it just brings me back to this ask of us, and this, I guess, this remembering that this is a courageous act, but that it also requires us to constantly return to wonder and curiosity. Wonder and curiosity about what is possible as humans. And I think that that's what you're talking about, Lisa, also, and you observing all these adults, right, that return to their wonder and curiosity for themselves. And so many of us who had to go through the ropes of conventional schooling and to in some way, what's the word? Not commodify, but yeah, so just go along with what's there, what systemically is there for us. It takes us all those 40 years, right? So all those years of schooling and all the next 10 years of practice to come to a place of being like, well, this is not how I want to spend my next 40 years.
Yeah. Well, I liked it. I just finished watching part of it, but I liked it so much because Astra said, you know, that her and her siblings got to have the in-depth exploration into what they were interested in that most people don't get until they go to graduate school. And that's if they go to graduate school. And I didn't go to graduate school. And I'm, you know, to me, so for me, I'm also like, oh, that's so curious. Does that mean I've never had this experience? And I almost wonder, like, I honestly kind of believe that maybe I haven't, because just, again, witnessing my children and seeing just how deep they go with things. And I also wanted to say, Deanna, back to what you were saying about TikTok or not knowing, again, you know, in that video, Astra also mentioned that, like, there were large periods of times where they did nothing, you know, they just hung out. Like if they weren't passionately engaged in something, they were doing nothing. And of course, we know that you can never really be doing nothing, but they were allowed to rest and relax and lay around or read books, or just, there was no pressure. And I think, like, again, even for myself, I know there have been windows of time where I'm better at allowing that in my home. And then there are periods of time where I stress about it. And again, just listening to her talk, I'm like, okay, you're off the hook, Lisa. Like, don't worry about it. Just let it be and everything's going to be cool, you know? And like, you know, I do believe that to be true, but you do, they just coming up against culture, you kind of, it's hard to just constantly be firm in the belief that, you know, it's all going to turn out okay.
And it's hard to constantly work against the conditioned mind that we were steeped in. And, you know, to come back to the curiosity and wonder and the, you know, possibility of what we haven't imagined because of the conditioned perspective that it can only fit within this box. And so we're really tasked with stretching ourselves for our children to thrive in and allow, being not allowed, but yeah, enabling them the space, staying out of their way to follow their wonder and curiosity. And as you were saying that about the, you know, those stretches of doing the nothing or boredom, or, you know, when I think that they're not thriving because it doesn't look a certain way, those periods do have their cycles and then turn around into much more active creativity, and, you know, something leaps and bounds are made with some kind of, you know, project or cognitive understanding or something. So I know that that's cyclical, and there's a process, a natural process of learning happening, right? Just like we watched our toddlers stumble and go through different levels of learning how to walk and talk and, you know, feed themselves and everything. Oh my God, that was so long ago. But it's more complex because for me, I start to, yeah, worry about them being out in the world and being prepared for that and all that. And I guess as I'm saying that now too, thinking out loud, I have something to look at in that my roadmap took me through grad school. And then when I was done with grad school, like I'm feeling like maybe some of that it has to do with this nervousness of that panic that I had finishing up school. And then I have to be out in the world, and I don't know how, because I've been in school so long with people telling me what to do and having the track. So I was like, holy shit, what the hell? So maybe that's some of the stuff I need to unpack that will then allow me to get more out of their way and not put more of my, you know, fear and worry onto them and disrupting their process. Because that's, you know, what it's always been, is all of a sudden me getting so anxious about a thought that disrupts their learning, you know?
I wanted to say, even what you were saying about like them, the kids being prepared to like go out in the world, is something that like I've been thinking about as well. Like this idea of, you know, because June has sort of talked about wanting to go to high school. And I think that's what's made me think about like, oh, we should start taking some classes. Like we need to prepare to take a class. We can't just take it. And while I've been having that thought, like simultaneously, you know, June's been teaching herself how to play music. Like she's been teaching herself the drums and the guitar and the piano. And then recently she started taking lessons. Like after not taking any lessons, she started taking them. And it's been so cool in lots of ways for me. One, she loves it, which is great. Like, you know, obviously we just want them to be happy, but it's been really great because all of the teachers love having her as a student. Like they're so excited to have her, because I think a lot of other kids taking music lessons are taking them because it's a have to. Like it's like, well, you need an extracurricular, so either pick a sport or an art, and that's what you have to do. So on the one hand, the teachers are already like, oh my gosh, we love having June. This is so great. So that's been one thing. And then the other thing that's been really cool is that because she's had been self-teaching, she can do a lot of things, but didn't know like the proper names for them. Like for example, on the guitar, she can play lots of songs and put her hands in lots of chord positions, but she doesn't know the names of the chords necessarily. And she doesn't know like the names of, you know, like arpeggio or, you know, all these musical terms that are part of a musical education. She's been learning without that. And it makes me wonder too, like how, you know, just how we kind of get caught up in the names of things and like this idea of like the proper way to learn something that actually slows down the learning. Whereas if someone who's genuinely interested just dives in and just does what they're interested, like, do they just go for it? And then eventually it comes back to a place. But, you know, she just had this, she had her first guitar lesson last week. And the teacher was like, well, let's just see, you know, I don't really know, you know, he was trying to ask me like, has she had lessons? What does she know? I'm like, I don't really know what she knows. Like, I'm not a guitar player. She plays, like, I don't know. And, you know, it was just so cool because he was like, oh, you can do this and you can do this. He's like, do you know what this is called? And you could just, the interaction between them, it was like as rewarding and fun for him as it was for her. And I don't know, even those experiences, I find them to be so joyful for me because I think, wouldn't it be great to like live in a world where teachers got to teach people who were passionate and engaged and wanted to be there versus teaching people who have to and really don't care but are just trying to like sort of get through the material.
Well, that's why the universities have like, you know, pages that where they're recruiting the homeschoolers for that reason. That they're seeing that as a fact, you know, the different presence and excitement and like the wonder and curiosity that they're coming to the schools with.
I have this experience that I want to share because I always want to locate these things and just the violence, right? The violence that we're committing as a society on each other, right? And for me, that, because this is the only context that I have directly affected me. Like for me, I only have colonization as a context, right? And then I have this experience of being from an indigenous community. And I want to share this story about growing up. So I grew up in the main town, city town. This is like the first Spanish settlement in Mexico, right? So this is 1500s, this town that I grew up in, right? So we still have churches from the 1500s. And so many indigenous communities, languages and dialects and ways of being all around this place. And so my mother, who learned Tzeltal, which is one of the Maya dialects, made a lot of relationships, particularly with the Tzeltal community, but all across the various different ethnic and dialects and communities. And so many families would come to visit us in the main town. So they would travel, like first they would walk to their main village, walk from wherever it is they were in the mountains to the main village, try to catch some sort of vehicle and pay for it to get to the market of my town, which is where the vehicles would land, and then walk to where our house was, right? So this was a whole planned journey just to come talk to my mother. And often it was about different things, different needs, or they wanted her to become the godmother, so they knew they had somebody who was able to stand by their children, many different needs. So I just want to, that was just the context, but the clear experience that I have, the memory, is that when we went to the village, when we went to that setting in the mountains, in these homes, right, where children were just running around, and this is pre like the heavy schooling of that came into these native communities, right? So when I was going into the villages, there were still kids that were growing up in their homes, didn't have access to literacy in that sense, but were learning, right? Because that was their world, that was their culture. You can see the children feeling so in their power, in their freedom, in their liberation, just running around, playing, doing their thing. But the moment that they came into our house, these same families, these same children that would come and see my mother, and they would come into our house, the children were in terror, right? And it was just this feeling within them. And, you know, like I would bring like toys and paper and coloring, you know, I was a child too, so I would just want to engage, but these children wouldn't. And this is coming from this experience, right, of being colonized and knowing that there's just certain places that don't feel safe to be liberated. And I feel like, so that's like my 1 degree to a memory, the closest memory I have of having been in a liberated space versus a space that was systemically oppressive, right? So the city, the colonial city, this big house of my mother's, she's American, right? She's not an indigenous person. So like all these different things, right? That would create that tension for that child. And I feel like if we were to like look at us now, you know, we're talking about generation after generation of being stripped violently from that liberation. Like when was the last space that we can recall in our own bodies, but also generationally, where that freedom existed throughout our childhood, you know, where it was like you could just be and you had the space to do that and to learn from the community that was around you, you know, because you weren't isolated. You had cross-generational knowledge and wisdom, and you were learning, I mean, just to think about like, just alone in these languages, there's just so much, right? And these dialects, so much knowledge exists in that way of speaking. And that alone, that incredible literacy to be able to speak an indigenous language, the tonality, just everything, right?
The cosmology of.
Yes, there's so much, right? So much is just alone in the language. And I think that we choose, and the violence that I'm talking about, I think is, we've been so far removed that we can't even imagine, and going back to the wonder and the curiosity, we can't even imagine that as a possibility. And when you go back to Astra Taylor's video and you get to like the Q&A, you can see how people asking her questions are still kind of like in this resistant mode of just like, what? Like, but how could you have learned physics if you weren't taught physics, right? Like, or if I was, or if I,
exists in nature, that's wow.
Or there was a question about a person having a single mother, right? And just like the assumption that a single mother would be less educated, less capable, right? That the single mother wouldn't have access to the grandparents, the uncles, the network of knowledge. You know, like we have these, we've been so violently stripped from the capacity to see what other possibilities can exist. You know, and then we commit the violence upon ourselves, right? So this pieces that you guys are bringing right now, it's just like, wow, we're really committing that violence back upon ourselves and then trickling back down to the kids.
We're trained well to perpetuate this economy, the colonized economy. Yeah, she names it too, that also about that privilege that this is, that you named in the last conversation too, that we have to be here, and that the people who really need to be rescued from the violence of institutionalized coercive education aren't able to, that, you know, that they're the ones who they aren't privileged to be able to find their way out, because we can't think it. It's not that they can't, that it's impossible. in terms of, like you named, a single mother being able to make that step out of it, but it's because we think we can't move out of the space of the tracks that we think are the only paths that we have to travel.
You know, the other thing that it made, like, yes, and the other thing that it made me think about too when I heard that question is about my own single parent, right? Who is a survivor, who was a survivor of domestic violence. And, you know, I was thinking about this right after that question too. It's just like, when I think about what possibilities out there, when I allow myself to think about what possibilities are out there, unschooling is just one of them. You know, unschooling is not the way, you know, like I wouldn't enter these conversations amongst us to say like, this is the way to do this, right? But when I was listening to her, because she also comes to some interesting thoughts about how unschooling also, there's something there that's needed for unschooling, and we can have that conversation later. But just this idea of the possibilities that we can access are a multitude. It's a multitude of possibilities that we can access when we allow ourselves to be creative. And so my mother was a single mother. She knew she couldn't keep me home. You know, she had to have 2, 3 jobs. She took me to her jobs often, right? As many single mothers have had to, particularly because I didn't have any grandparents around at that time. And yet she was very creative about passing me down the capacity to see possibilities, to see other ways. And I feel like in a way we can really push the boundary of unschooling in that way, you know, like really just push through that, you know. It doesn't have to look this way. It doesn't have to be like a couple that one parent stays home and then the kids can be home and be free. No, push that, like really, let's just decenter that as the experience of unschooling. What unschooling is really standing for in my eyes is just the capacity to see other ways of being here, of being human, of being alive, of being in family, right? And so for a single mom, what can that look like? Like my mother's example was, we are gonna take a little Datsun, yellow Datsun truck, and we're gonna travel around Mexico, and I'm gonna show you other ways of life. And we're gonna sleep in the flow of somebody's house, of the fisherman. Or we're gonna go and do Danza Azteca, and we're gonna go into a cave and do Danza Azteca in a cave. And we're gonna have to sing all night. You know, it's like push the ways in which we can be here on earth from wherever you are.
You're on fire, Maria.
That's what I like for Asha. I was just like, go ahead, girl. Go ahead.
I love that. I love that sense of adventure. Yeah.
Well, it's like too, like, you know, what is unschooling? It's living, right? And there are endless ways to live. And I think also that's sort of like what Astra's talking about. And again, I only saw the first half. I can't wait to watch the rest. But that being in school is not really living. And I know people will sort of like want to contradict that because it's like, well, of course it is. Like, this was it. I woke up in the morning and I went to school. But it's like, as soon as you're done with school, right? Like, you can choose all kinds of things to do every day, every hour, every minute. Like, you know, you're finally allowed to make the decisions. And when you opt out, it can look any which way. It's really what it comes down to, is that you have that choice to choose, and you have that like freedom and that time to pick, like, oh, today I'm gonna play video games because that's what I'm into, and tomorrow maybe it's like you go to an aquarium, or like maybe the next day you're gonna like make a collage. Like there's nothing. It's like whatever happens, and that's gonna look different depending on your family makeup, depending on like where you live regionally, depending on, you know, just it's infinite. Just like how where I live, affects my life now. I live in a place, today was really, really cold, and so I had to like wear warm weather clothing, and it's like good that I know how to layer and all these things where if I was living in a warm weather place, I might not have known that, but it doesn't mean that like going to a cold weather place means I'm incapable of surviving there. You know what I mean? I'm going to figure it out because at that moment it's necessary and it's important and it has value to me to learn how to dress in cold weather. But it's not like, oh my gosh, before I go to that cold place, I need to take a class. I need to have a teacher, I need to have a book about living in cold weather, and then I'm going to take quizzes on like what you wear and how you behave when it's cold. And only after I've gotten a good grade and my teacher says I've learned it, can I then go to that cold weather place, But that's the protocol that we get indoctrinated into and that we then internalize and apply in all situations, when, like what you were saying, there are just unlimited possibilities. And when something is of interest or of need to a person, there's lots of ways to approach it. But like we, for kids, think that like the only way to approach it is to hire a professional or like be in the under the tutelage of a professional who's going to educate us into knowing how to be, and without it we would be lost. But that's not true.
And parenting, one of the hardest jobs I've ever had. There are no degrees and courses, and well, I guess there are parenting courses, but seriously, like you don't get a license to become a parent. So there are like a lot of things like that in life, and even project management. I remember, hi Leaf, I remember when Fred was considering studying for project management, and it was an investment. And I was like, no, you already have that information. You can just go. But the structures, the systems make it very limiting for people unless you have that, project management title degree. Maybe, less so now or in some situations, but it's the systems that are forcing us to follow these certain paths. It's like it's all this colonized economy that perpetuates that violence, and the violence upon learning and how we learn, and kills creativity. But hello. Hi Leaf, peekaboo. But we can think outside. We need, the world is calling for us to be creative in ways to like, repair the damage we've done as a result of this relentless violence on the earth because of this economic model. So it's all connected. But yeah, I'm so inspired. It's things like that video, and talking with you, and even, Lisa, hearing you talk about your experience at the farm today, and Maria, your memories of that connection to the earth and community just brings me back home. Like, because there is that memory within us. Like if we can find our way to it, right? It feels so good when we know that feeling, when it feels right. And like, I think Lisa, you were talking about it earlier, when we aren't in touch with that within ourselves, it's hard to come to that place. That's how each of us got to unschooling, right? By listening to something within us that was saying it was right. And the tragedy is that so many, because of this violence and this colonized, and marketed thinking and way of being, we don't then listen to those little nudges, and get stuck in spaces where kids don't thrive, where our lives aren't fulfilling, where we aren't creative, where we put aside our dreams and our wonder and curiosity, even when we have the privilege to do so. That makes me sad. And so it's exciting when these conversations happen, and when you share this video and people are talking about it, and it makes me wonder what she's doing now. I want to see what other conversations she's had.
You know what? At the beginning of the pandemic, she had written an article, I believe in The Atlantic, that I had read. And so when you shared this video, Maria, I was like, I know that name. I recognize that name. And then I realized she had written an article about unschooling, because right at the beginning, when everyone's kids came home, everybody was sort of losing their minds. And I mean, they still are, but there was this real fear of like learning loss, and like how a generation of children has lost 2 years of forming their minds. And so she had sort of written an article kind of like, well, is that real? Like, or could this time be, truly exploratory and open for them to, to learn, which
it can, but unfortunately, also the truth is that they are languishing and mentally, like there's a huge mental crisis as a result, because they're not busy, at school, they're not actively spoon-fed, and they're just on their devices, and so it's also a really real, a very real thing that there's a mental health crisis for children. But I don't know what is going on that that is the case, like, is it just because they're not in school? I don't think so.
Well, I think too,
and the pandemic, obviously.
Well, I think to me the big difference is having parents who are like joyfully and intentionally and by choice keeping their kids out and being like, go forth and explore. We trust in your curiosity. That's a radically different container to grow and learn in than one where it's like, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous that my kid isn't in school right now and they're gonna lose all this learning. Like those are radically different.
Absolutely. And that is such a key. I mean, I've just read this story about a woman who gave birth to premature twins, and years ago, it's a really interesting book, a side story I'll tell you later, but in it, they were saying how the hospital was saying that they can feel vibration really, they're really sensitive. So if you're not feeling in a strong and positive place, it's okay to not come to the hospital that day. It's better to show up and be in a place where you're not exuding waves of negative emotion and fear and sadness and panic. So of course the kids are going to pick up on this, and in this climate with all the fear as well. But this made me think about like how much I have done that, since they were little, and how guilty and ashamed I felt about that. But that's another story, a lot of learning, right? But how what you're saying is so important. I like what she wrote. I wrote this down, that to facilitate learning by speaking, holding hands and encouraging, you know, in answer to like, do we trust people's capacity to be curious? And like the parents are just there to facilitate that. And if we can just omit all of my worry and like frustration, oh my God, it would be a piece of cake. It would be so much easier to trust them. And we've had many conversations about that trust and control.
That's because we still don't trust ourselves.
Right. Right. And those kids aren't trusting themselves to learn also because they are expecting to have to be in front of someone telling them what to do. And yeah, I'm conditioned, I'm a product of that conditioning. And I still sometimes find myself looking for that, like outside of myself, to what to do, of how to parent and how to teach, you know. I still go back to like, okay, no, am I supposed to be teaching? No, I can encourage them. I can hold their hands. I can speak to them, just speak with them, find out, be curious.
Yeah,
And
you know,
when I want to say one more thing as a memory, when you were talking, Maria, about that connection to place and the violence, like how we don't have that experience of that free space of being a child, it made me think of my most fondest cherished memories, and why you just like answered the question of why that would be, is when I was just running barefoot up in the woods when we would visit our friends in Vermont, and falling and tripping into pond, you know, brooks, and getting burrs caught on my clothes and looking at bugs. Yeah, you know, totally free to explore. And I was learning viscerally, just one-on-one with nature, with the world around me. So yeah, that.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you for bringing that forward, that visceral space. And I think we can all of us three and everybody who gets to listen to this can go and find that, and it would be very similar, you know. And what are the ingredients of that? Is the full trust of our caregivers and the love from our caregivers that we can go and do that. I think that was one of the ingredients, along with, you know, that access to that freedom for that moment.
Thank you.
You know, I wanted to go back, just if I could, to this piece of, I don't even know if I can gather the language for this. I love how Lisa is just so ready to, I love the way that you're so ready to put it all into wonderful language. And sometimes I'm a little slower. So I hope you and the audience can.
You've been on fire. I'm sure we'll get it. We'll get it. Go for it.
But I think that the thought that is really lingering in me is the way in which this pandemic is affecting us all, right? And so I really want to acknowledge and affirm to all of us that we're going through a very difficult time, period. Like, our lives have been shaken to the core. Everything we knew is gone. You know, like, we can't be together. We have to wear masks in certain spaces because it means life, or it means health or unhealth, and possibly even death, right? For some. Yeah, so everything's upended at some level, right? And all of us are being affected in different ways. So for us unschoolers, maybe it's been a bit smoother in some areas and difficult in others, right? For families who are schooling right now and working, or working and schooling at home, or having to figure out, yeah, I mean, it's just a lot. I just want to affirm that that's a lot. that's a lot to have to be with. And so when we say, why are children and all of us emotionally and mentally dysregulated right now, it's because our lives have been upended. And we just need to be able to do a collective acknowledgement that we are all dysregulated right now. We entering almost into a third year of this. Like, our lives are so vastly different. And so for me, it's just like, okay, well, let's just take a pause with that. Let's just say, yeah, this is fucking difficult on all of us and our kids. And yeah, we're gonna have mental breakdowns. And that's just gonna be what's gonna be. But the question that comes after that pause, after like, let's just acknowledge that, I feel is, if we can stay on a state of wonder through this moment, if we can allow ourselves the possibility to be curious about what's in here for us. And I think for a lot of people in the last couple of years, there's been some revelations around that. I don't have to commute to the office. I can work from home just as well. Or I can create mutual aids for communities that need that support. Or, the list can go on. I don't want to like spend too much time on that, but I think that overall, this is a juicy time as much as it is a very difficult time.
Yeah.
And I don't want for myself to fall into the trap of being a victim of this moment. And I don't want to bring that to my children either, right? Like, the energy that I want to hold, as I am also, being affected by this, as I am also feeling the mental and emotional wear down and tear down of this moment, I want to be able to come back to all my resources to be able to say, okay, what are the possibilities? What can I be curious about right now? How can, actually reminds me of something that was really just humbling for me through this mutual aid work of working with undocumented communities in our area, which is that I saw these mothers like stepping up to the challenge in the middle of incredible need. Undocumented, having to keep the children at home and having to work as essential workers in grocery stores and food business, whatever it is, and getting COVID, in that first year, like having to deal with the worst of it all of this last year. And still being able to be curious and in wonder of how to make it work. Okay, so we live in an apartment building. Who's the person who's going to be able to take care of the kids? Who's the person who's going to be able to go and get food if I need it? Building relationship with pharmacists. Being on a one-on-one with a lady at the pharmacy so that they can get the support they need. And I just want to say too, maybe this is a little bit like on another tip, but I just want to name too that people in spaces where there's poverty, and this is not to romanticize this, I just want to name it, that in spaces of lack, humans have to get really creative. And I feel like if we were to dissect like that, the learning that happens in that space of need, we would see, wow, this is an unschooling process. In spaces of poverty, everybody has a hustle. Why? Because you have to have the 2 jobs plus your 3 hustles to be able to survive. And so going back to, I don't even want to go into that direction, but just to name that That's creativity. Like the lady on a Facebook Marketplace who's got a little side hustle, has 2 jobs and has a little side hustle with her van of getting cheap furniture and then reselling it for a little bit more. That's creativity to me. That's like figuring out how I'm going to use my skills to be able to sustain my family.
This reminds me of this book that I'm reading in a book club right now. We talking about this, that creativity and the soul of money, and really looking at, yeah, it is a slightly different topic, but it requires this unschooling perspective of being, looking at the world differently, the structures differently we're being creative. You're talking about being creative within the current system, but what if, we take that creativity and where we are able to like stretch it, push it, like you were talking about, in whatever capacity we have.
Exactly.
Right? Like some people, they can work in the capacity of, government and or politics and make changes on the institutional levels for the education system. And then other people, like me, I work one-on-one or in smaller communities, or, having these conversations with you and other guests that come on to just get, just like you said with this, the Q&A afterwards, people are asking these questions, but there is a questioning happening, which I think is missing a lot, and questioning the status quo. And that's what we're stretching these neural pathways to do. Yeah.
Well, and again, I think again, right, just back to this like school thing, is that I do think that part of what we learn in school is that there's a certain way to do things, which, isn't true, but that becomes the pattern that we learn, that there's a prescription, there's a certain way that things are done, and we need to do them in that way. And I think, the pandemic, for better or for worse, has shown us all collectively that there are other options and that there are other ways, and that like when the necessity arises, we can come up with other ways of doing things. And, it's unfortunate that it's taken illness or fear of illness to show a world that we can work from home and we can still do a good job, and we can lose the hour commute, or that we can even not live right outside of a major city. Like, oh, okay, wow, you know what? I could actually live in a place where I can have acreage, or the taxes are lower, or I could go and live close to family where before people are living near their jobs. Like we've been capable of this, but it took like everybody needing it for collectively us to like implement.
And we needed our hand forced
that way. And I think it's the same thing, that there have been people learning outside of school, like even back to what you were saying, like, how could you learn physics without a class? Well, it's like, who's the first person who learned physics? Like, they didn't learn it from a teacher, they learned it from living. And then they weren't the only person who learned it from living. Like, lots of different people were figuring things out. And then, collectively, we learn lots of things on our own. And in fact, a lot of times I think that the most meaningful learning is coming from our own direct experiences, not
the one we retain most, for sure.
I would also stretch it a little bit just on the physics tip. It's like, who's to say that physics is the only way of understanding how the world works, right? There's been like countless and numerous ways of thinking and knowledge, you know, like think about all the types of humans that have lived on Earth that have had to engage with how the world is the world, how the universe is the universe, who have put in place whatever systems.
Yeah, we're still learning.
Even like physics, like we think of physics as like being something that like a scientist you can only do in a lab. When I think, well, you know, when I'm on my roller skates and I'm going into like a bowl at the skate park, that is all physics, you know, all energy, and how does one movement affect another movement? And like, I couldn't have read a book about it. You know, it's like you can only figure that out by actually like putting your skates on and going in the thing, and you fall down a lot and you get bruises, but it's like that's how you are figuring out the cause and effect of movement and energy. But again, like it's not, it doesn't give the same signal as a degree in physics from a university. And like really, like a lot of school, and I think again Astra was talking about this, and I think as our own kids are getting older and they're curious about going to school, I think a lot of the curiosity is actually about the signals. Like, you know, having a high school degree that gives a certain signal, as does having a college degree and a graduate degree. And those things aren't equivalent necessarily to learning or internalized knowing, but it is a signal that says I've gone through these certain steps, and people are like, oh, I also went through those steps, so we could probably do similar things. But like you could probably
give you a sense of belonging, and not to poo-poo, you know, the higher education, because surely if our kids find themselves interested in something and they want to dive deeper into it, then they'll get there. But the beauty of what we're doing is, like she explained with her brother, who got really good at computer science and went to intern at age 16 and decided, oh, he doesn't want to actually work in that field, that he didn't have to go through a whole education through college to and debt to find out that that's not what he wanted to do. So our children hopefully will be finding what they do want to do early on, and then we'll have all that much more time to pursue higher education should they choose or want or need it.
That's back to TikTok. May I?
Yeah. And then I have to wrap up because
I was gonna say we're up on time. But it makes me think, and particularly my two teens who are heavily following what this whole generation is following, which are these ways of connecting online and being plugged in and following each other and following what's the beat of that, which is that this happens to be the way of their day. This is how they're going to come to understand what the world is going to look like in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years in these spaces. And we can have every opinion we want to have about it. And there's definitely access to not very positive things on there, but they are learning quite quickly. And this I've seen, just from first experience of observation, they're learning quite quickly how to navigate it safely for themselves. And they're learning quite quickly how it is useful and how it is not. It does take a little bit longer to learn. What I'm seeing is that it takes a little bit longer to learn the agency of how much to engage with it on a daily basis. But I have noticed that when my teens are working on a skill or on a project or on an idea, their engagement with that thing is not there. They're somewhere else, right? And that their engagement with that thing is also partially this like social and anthropological experiment of seeing what is happening to this beat of our generation. Like, how are we being in this space as a collective? Which is very different than any other generation of us who have been with
Yeah,
the
you
internet.
can't
Like, this is
fit that
a
many
very
people on the corner, on a convenience store corner, which is where our beat was, you know, outside.
Exactly. So
But
yeah,
that
it's
much more, that many more minds getting together,
Mhm.
exchanging ideas too. It's exciting.
It is very interesting, very exciting. And I'm also seeing the connections that come out of that. And there's just so much learning coming out of these spaces and these connections and these ways of understanding the way that people communicate. And they're also really, they're becoming very adept at reading the older generations because they can see through what's truth and what's lie coming from other generations. You know, they can really, it's fascinating. I'm still trying to come to some core language around it because it's a really interesting observation and experience. But what I would say in terms of TikTok and all of those things is that the best way, or what I found the most useful way for myself and our family, are we talking to the kids? Are the kids wanting to talk to us about it? Is your child, am I writing my child to X activity? And is she like just opening up all the things that are happening on Twitter, in her Twitter sphere of art and whatever it is that she follows? Is she just sharing that with me willingly? And teaching me along the way about those
Are we
observations.
curious enough to make them feel like we're interested? Right? They're not going to talk to us if we give off like, oh, we're not interested, or disregard, or when, yeah, there have been times when Vivian has like shared something and she, you know, grieved to me once that like there were a couple times it got to her when I was too busy to really take in and receive it. But she expressed that to me, and now I really pay attention to that and make sure that I listen when she's willing to share with me. And then when I prompt her, she's much more willing to talk.
Mhm.
After
And
this-
it's, you know, they can pick up when you were listening, but are not
Oh, yeah.
interested.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And like, I've learned that this is actually really interesting. I want to know
Right.
what you're finding out.
Yeah,
I feel really grateful. for
very
what-
complex stuff. Sometimes like it really takes all of my focus to understand because it is new. It's technology. It's topics sometimes that are so much more advanced than where I was, you know, what I was steeped in growing up. So they're really gonna, yeah, they are much more prepared for this world than we are, than their older generations are currently.
That's a really good way of putting
So
it.
in that, like, I really should have no worries. But
And I feel like the
Lisa,
conversation.
you were gonna,
Oh, yes, Lisa, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, you know, all TikTok is, or Snapchat, or any of they're all just tools to share information. And ultimately, again, it's like we judge what information is valuable, and we judge what vehicle for delivering information is most valuable. But really, all that is a sign of is our own narrow-mindedness,
yeah,
where our kids are less narrow-minded. And I just was going to say today, my parents came over, and Lela taught my mom how to use Snapchat. She had my mom download Snapchat, and the two of them for like an hour worked on Snapchat, and it was like just so joyful and funny. And then within moments of my mom getting her Snapchat account opened and her and Lela going back and forth. My niece saw that my mom was on Snapchat, and my niece started following my mom. And so it then opened this other pathway for connection between her and another grandchild that before didn't exist. And I just think all of this could easily, so it's so
Mm,
it's so tenuous, and it's so easy to just shut the stuff down
totally.
before it happens. But
Yeah.
again, within the container of acceptance, love, and support, any of this, they're all just tools. And sometimes you use a certain tool every single day, all day long, because that tool is really getting you what you want. But then you can also they can also walk away from it. Just like you were saying, Maria, when something else is more interesting or more pressing or more valuable, like they might not use that tool at all. And I just think, like, there's so many ways of knowing, and there are so many things to know, and nobody can know everything, and nobody can know how to use all of the tools. And we need all of the tools, and we need all of the information. So we need all kinds of people to be interested and pursuing all kinds of things. So to be so limited as to say the best way to learn is by reading a book and having an expert tell you, and the best things to learn are English literature written by white men, and physics taught to you, in a high school laboratory. And like, just saying this, we are limiting the possibilities of the human species. And like, I know it sounds crazy. Like, sometimes I say this stuff and I'm like, people are just,
Nope. It
you're so
sounds
far out there,
so
but it's
clear.
the truth. It's the truth. We can't, no one person can know everything. And it's like one of those things too. It's like, I think about it, it's like, we can't all be CEOs. Like, yeah, sure, everybody would love to be paid what a CEO makes, or everybody would love to like have, but it's like, we can't all be that, or we can't all be heart surgeons. And
Yeah.
guess
And the earth can't sustain that anyway.
it's like, if we all became heart surgeons, guess what? None of us would actually be able to operate, because we need somebody to build the hospital. We need somebody to electrify the hospital. We need people to pave the roads to get to the hospital, and build the cars and the ambulances that are going to take us to the hospital. We need people to clean the hospital. We need administrators to make sure everything is stocked. And if we all went and we're like, we're going to become brain or heart surgeons because they make a lot of money and they have a lot of esteem, it's like we would all just die out. And so for me, I'm like, when can we get to the place where we are valuing it all and appreciating it all, so we can all live with abundance and joy and support and dignity? Like, that's
Yeah,
what
not be ashamed of it. Right, exactly. I think you've brought it all to a beautiful close with love and unconditional support and curiosity, all of that you said. Thank you, Lisa.
you guys.
And Maria, thank you so much.
Thank you, ladies.
I
This
was
was-
thinking
this
what-
was fire.
Yeah. And I was thinking it would be fun to, like, I don't know, maybe check out some of the books that she named, and I don't know if we can do a book club segment.
Actually, most of the books I read when I became a teacher, because I went to a very liberal program for education. And so we read Coastal, we read like Summerhill, all those books were part of my curriculum back then. So it was so incredible to hear her name those things.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can find another one we
Gato.
haven't read yet, or something that we're inspired to read and share. Yeah, just organically
Yeah,
see what
it's a great list for sure. I definitely would recommend all of that. And I would love to revisit some of that work too. I'm for
If
it.
there's one in particular, as you look at it again, that you want to recommend we read and talk about. It just would be a fun way to focus and continue conversations.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank you.
Be inspired.
This was really enriching. Thank you. Thank you for bringing it back to practice, Ali. Both of you. I feel like you bring it back to the practicum of this life, and I really appreciate that.
I appreciate
Sharing
you.
that video. I'm gonna go watch the rest of it before I go to bed.
Yes,
I'm gonna go
enjoy.
finish watching Ghostbusters with the kids.
Enjoy, fam.
Mwah. Love you guys.
Thank you for
you.
the time.